for thought. In the beginning, I'm just going to take you through the projects that we think carry this point, and we're very interested to hear a little bit about maybe the work that you're doing and how that applies to your context. And then talk a little bit about how that challenges us, so back to kind of what's stopping us and what the routes through it might be. And then a third piece just to close on what our program is for this year. So that's what I'm offering you today in the next 40 minutes. And I'm going to start straight in with some examples. And these are the projects that we're looking at and trying to understand, I guess, a kind of a typology of projects which are working in open and collaborative ways, so that we can start to see how similar approaches and methods, how similar skills applied can be applied for different strategic ends. So if you're talking about something like solving systemic challenges, something people are talking an awful lot about currently, we have an example like Tony's Open Chain. So everyone knows Tony's Chocolonely. Not many people know about Tony's Open Chain, which is working behind the scenes. It's an alliance of people, of organizations involved in the cocoa supply chain, which is famously problematic in all kinds of ways, from child labor to all kinds of lack of regulation, deregulation, people working around regulation. Welcome, Mike. We were saying it's a small and intimate gathering today. We're hoping that just means a lot of people signed up in order to see the recording. So we're going to try and put on a good show and try and make it a kind of a good run through. And I've just started straight in with some examples of what we're talking about when we say the only way is open. And these examples illustrate some new ways of working, some ways of working which maybe aren't new, but maybe are more pertinent and more relevant to people's agendas now, so we're getting more attention. We're kicking off with Tony's Open Chain, this alliance of 100 or more organizations working across the cocoa supply chain. And they're quite significant players in that supply chain. They're very influential. They're working in a way where previously they might have worked in competition, working in alliance, and they found it not just to be achieving against its impact goals, but also working to improve. You can track it back, they're tracking their economic impact as well. So they're finding that it's commercially and financially rewarding to work in this way, something which is counter to people's assumptions. When they see these types of initiatives, they tend to cast them into nice to have, not for profit, well-meaning, but not commercially feasible. People like Tony's are starting to work at a level of scale where you can not just point to it as an inspiring example, but you can point to it as an example that's fully realized and starts to make those kinds of, I guess, the kind of quantitative arguments that can be seen as lacking. I'm going to roll you through a few other examples. Water, obviously, is a huge challenge, and apart from the obvious, I guess, issues around some of the ways that the water companies operate, you have got water companies who are starting to work in new ways, and we've been in close conversation with Northumbrian Water. It's an innovation festival that they run. They've run annually for the last 8 years. An innovation festival sounds a little bit, when you see the videos online, it looks a little bit like a kind of a cheerleading, a kind of a community engagement exercise, something which perhaps has, a great kind of visibility and kind of marketing message, trying to improve the image of the water company. When you dig into what they're actually doing on those days and how that integrates across the company and how that kind of follow through happens, who comes, who's in the room, from their supply chain to their workers, and what kinds of problems they're surfacing through this project and how they're going about solving it, it starts to look like much more like the visible end of their innovation lab, which they're using in a way to engage their communities in a very constructive, very participatory way. The skills which are going into this, the practices that they're engaging on when they're kind of convening, when they're giving a platform to all these different stakeholders, both internal and external. It's hugely impressive. And that kind of dismissal of these exercises as a marketing exercise is to underestimate their potential and not tap into their power. And Northumbrian Water, I definitely have some kind of lessons to share in that regard. Third example, when we're talking about community support, and I think this is really pertinent, and again, it's something that could be dismissed as a community open day, something that's nice to have, a little bit like having a school fair. But actually what Veolia are doing in a very interesting way is engaging all across their communities in ways which embed them in place, which embed them in localities, and which for an organization which needs to have community support for their impact on local communities as they put in waste and recycling plants, as increasingly you're trying to embed a circular economy locally. These kinds of exercises go way beyond an idea of kind of emotionally connecting with communities or supporting local initiatives, and go very deeply into strategic relationships which might support alternative ways of working in the future. And I think talking to the community, to the Chartered Institute of Waste Management, when you start to look at their skills strategy, when you start to look at the way that they foresee waste being advancing as a primary resource, you have all kinds of questions about how waste, how manufacturing, local manufacturing, how it embeds in local communities. So these exercises become less an exercise in kind of relationship management and more an exercise in a more kind of core strategic development of the organization. Again, I think there's 2 or 3 more of these, and then I'm going to be asking you a little bit. So I'd love you to think about, how do these relate to your context, or how do these relate to exercises that you're going through at the moment? I'll spin you through a couple more. And I'm hoping you're starting to see these organizations are coming from very, very different backgrounds. They're coming from kind of manufacturing and production, through to retail, through to waste management. This initiative called Public Practice is a collaboration which is funded through local authorities, through the Mayor's Office in London. It's got a huge kind of public sector base. And the challenge that they had was the talent pipeline. And I hate the word pipeline, but the talent pipeline for planners in local authorities was basically being mined by developers. So people new candidates were going to commercial developers rather than the public sector, seeing the public sector as a place which was more isolated from progressive practices, perhaps, that was not a place to thrive as a planner. And this consortium, which set up as a new institution, effectively, Public Practice, brought together cohorts of learners, re-looked at qualifications, looked at a new format for embedding effectively internships in local planning offices, and by working collaboratively have managed to reinvigorate a whole sector and rechart those kinds of relationships with emerging practitioners. And I think when we're talking about talent and skills pipelines, and particularly skills gap, that type of collaborative working, whether that's in public sector or in commercial sector, is increasingly necessary. And likewise, something called the Skills Centre, which is a multi-site organization which is embedding in local areas. And the next 2 examples are really looking at kind of novel formats, again, for attraction and retention also of skilled workers in sectors which are really challenged in terms of their skills pipeline. And I think anytime when we're talking about green skills, we are talking about huge skills gaps. I was talking yesterday to someone from Work Manufacturing Group who was talking about 250,000 small manufacturing businesses who haven't really started to think about green skills, who haven't really started to think about how they're going to bring their people through, so the people who are already in the workplace, let alone the people who are coming through the education and apprenticeship flows. So these kinds of novel formats, in this case, the Skills Centre, almost a pop-up hub, which sits in construction sites and recruits and trains from local talent. And likewise, the next one I think is Sayura Hospitality, who I think is a really, really, really interesting, because it's so fast tracked, because hospitality training obviously happens on a different cycle to construction skills. You're able to pop up a school for 6 weeks, work with a consortium of employers, and then bring people through that system through into the workplace on a very kind of fast track system. What's interesting here is that facilitative role of effectively a learning provider popping up in a location, bringing industry in to partnership and collaboration, and actually quite an exciting kind of, you know, thrilling ride through, you know, something which you don't really associate with local vocational colleges, for example. So you can kind of invest these formats, these novel formats. But what you do need, obviously, is industry buy-in, and you need organizations to be prepared to work collaboratively with people that they might previously have seen as competitive. So I think that's the last example that we've put up. The reason we're looking at these, the reason we're looking at these formats, and we're specifically in First Down, and that's the lunchtime briefing today, the only way is open. You know, the reason we're specifically looking at this is because we're not just us, we know from the kinds of challenges that we're facing, systemic challenges, openness and collaboration, they're no longer optional. So this kind of working, this kind of looking outwards, working with competitors, working in novel formats is something we increasingly have to do. It's something that can bring benefits to organizations, bring in new ideas, unlock innovation. It builds community support, it attracts and retains talent. It's really talking about a kind of resilience, which I guess, whereas previously business might have looked within their own boundaries to consider whether they're resilient or not, it's increasingly important to look to the sector or to look to the wider economy in order to assure that resilience. So those are the kinds of themes that we're looking at. We're really interested in the novel formats for learning and skills that come through, because we cannot rely on running it through the normal process where maybe industry is making innovation, it's running back through to educational institutions and then coming back out in the form of graduates. We want to talk to people who are active now, experimenting, doing these projects in ways which bring people with them. And that's our purpose, I guess, this year, is to both support and advocate for those people who are doing it, and to do a little bit ourselves. And that's what I'll be telling you about at the end of this. Oh, there was one final message I wanted to get, was just that it's not all, you know, some of the options are the examples that I've been showing you here are NGOs, they are third sector, they are sitting in not-for-profits or mission-led organizations. But the other people who really, really get this are really big business. So if you start to look at the top, so this is a quote from Boston Consulting Group. And if you look at Tesla, if you look at Gucci, if you look at any of the kind of really, really super scaled organizations, they're really, really good at working in ecosystems in the way that we've illustrated here. I haven't put them up as case studies because I'm not sure there's much to emulate about them, but you can really see that the places who are the organizations that are really making progress in this regard are the ones who are mission led, who are really looking at how we can take these methods and these approaches into play as assets and as tools, resources in the face of complex challenges of climate change, of social justice, etc. But also at the other end of the spectrum, you've got large conglomerates who are really recognizing that they can't continue to work in that kind of individualistic and entrepreneurial way, that the new forms of innovation are coming through in alliances and in, as I say here, business ecosystems. They might be tipping that into ideas of monopoly, ideas of cartels even. You know, there's another side to ecosystem working, which does, I guess, stray into a dark side, and that's something that you have to be actually quite conscious of when you start to look at anti-competitive laws, etc. I'm not going to get into that detail today. But I just wanted to ask the group that are here today, I don't know whether you want to drop in the chat as we've done in previous things, but we're such a small group today. Maybe you'd like to talk about examples that you have, or that things that you're doing yourself, just for a few minutes. You know, we have a few minutes to chat. If there's something you'd like to table, we are collecting these examples. So anything that you share, you know, we'd love to showcase more work like this. But if you want to drop in the chat, or if you'd like to just jump in, we'd be interested to hear if you've got anything you're working on. I'm going to sit with that silence just for a second. It's also to break the sound of my own voice.
So maybe if no one is going to jump in, I will try to say something regarding this. I think it's quite interesting what you're doing and what you have presented. And myself, I'm working in Arup, is a very small team called Arup Venues. We're dealing with art and culture mainly. And one project that really sparks in mind and maybe could be a very good example to what you have just presented and might be relevant is 2 years ago, we did something in Uganda. There is the largest South Sudanese refugee camp. It's nearly 300,000 people, I think, now. It was around 250,000 back then. When we worked with Tuareg, with Hustle, and we tried to put together settlement for them in terms of what they can represent and work with arts and culture. Like for them, very important was dance and music. This is something that really brought them together as a community. Just thinking of the size of it. And how we've done it was to instruct them and also to empower them to do that by themselves. So we only used local materials. We brought good water to them as well, and they managed to build it themselves. So we brought them some very large brick press. They used the soil, the earth that could be found there, and they just pressed those bricks. Doesn't need to be fired. The soil is a very interesting with very many properties in terms of materiality and rigidity. And they managed to build that in 8 months, around 800,000 bricks, and then they kept those presses and they are building their houses now, which I thought is actually quite powerful from that point of view, because also what they've learned is how to shape the roof to maximize rainwater collection, and how this could also support to do future nurseries and vegetable gardens. And they're actually building, it's a city built from scratch, which is, I think, very, very powerful from that point of view, given that they are displaced.
Can you share a link on some?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yes. Put that in chat.
Thank you, Andrea. So for the next part, I'm just going to talk a little bit and without too many frameworks in here. And this is a bit of a complex diagram. So I'm going to interpret for you a little bit and let you sit with it. On the left-hand side, this is really the kind of challenges that we might face, everything from cooking a meal down in the left-hand corner, right the way up to global governance frameworks in the top right-hand corner. On the left-hand side, the axis is dimensionality, really meaning the interdependency of the different, or the different facets of that challenge. On the bottom, agency, the ability of single actors through to multiple actors to resolve that challenge. So obviously the most complex have got multiple dimensions and multiple actors involved. The most simple, cooking a meal, down the left-hand side, the fewest. Thank you, Andrea. The arrow is ours, obviously, because that simplicity, the idea that cooking a meal is a simple thing that you have total control over. What we're seeing, obviously, is those straightforward tasks in an era of more visibility of the complexity of these challenges even can become quite challenging, because we know that being vegan is one of the primary actions we can take as an individual, for example. So that conversation in your house has gained more dimensions. So where in the 1990s cooking a meal may have been totally straightforward, you would not have a second thought about going to the supermarket, buying some mince in a container and cooking something very straightforward. Those questions, those kinds of personal interrogations, add layers of complexity to those simple tasks. And likewise, many of the things that we are talking about, things which we might have seen as isolated tasks that we could complete with relative simplicity, have become more layered, have become more complex in the era that we live in. So this has it brings lots of challenges with it. I don't need to rehearse with you. There's people who know a lot more about what that brings, say, in terms of our own sense of identity, or our own sense of community, or our own sense of agency, etc. What we're interested in within the projects that we're facing is what additional skills do we need in order to make some of those decisions and in order to address those challenges. So this increase in complexity, these ideas of what we can have agency over, we need to be able to manage those as individuals, but in our work context in particular, we also need additional skills beyond what we may have needed in the past. And I think when the projects that we've been looking at, those first 6 or 8 examples that I set in front of you, we're often talking about the technical challenges that they engage with. So for example, in construction skills, we're often talking about green skills as meaning the ability to calculate carbon footprint, the ability to consider the life cycle of a material, innovations in terms of materials passports. What we talk about less is the necessity of us collaborating up and down our supply chain, and what that means to the way that we interact with people in a work context. And particularly in a post-COVID context where perhaps we're not in offices, those skills are those what might have been dismissed as soft skills once upon a time, which might have been pushed forward as 21st century or future skills. That ability to collaborate, to be creative as you're trying to introduce new practices and new ideas, to be able to navigate those complexities, those generic skills. And I could keep on using fresh terms for them. So soft skills, 21st century skills, generic skills, or now deemed by the UK government, transformative green skills. Those start to come to the fore because that ability to deal with complexity relies more and more on our ability to create those relationships and to work collaboratively. And by not seeing that as highly skilled work, by concentrating on those technical innovations to carry us through, we start to lose that idea that working ecosystemically is a story of trust. So what I've put in front of you there, Systems Innovation Network is talking about, it's not about blanket collaboration. It's not about everyone collaborating with everyone all of the time on some happy story where we're all, working toward one shared goal. That's an impossibility. Everything we know about everything we do tells us that's an impossibility. But that idea that some things lend themselves to competition and we can complete them alone, and it's simple and it's straightforward and it's fast. And that there's a world of collaboration and participation, that we need to have the skills and we need to have the awareness about how we apply those skills and when they become relevant. And then somewhere in the middle, there's something which mixes those up as well. And that ability to think critically about those situations, to be able to respond with agility and flexibility, to be able to navigate that complexity, that those are skills that we need to cultivate, not talents that are innate. And we need to be able to scale those skills. We need to be able to replicate those skills in different situations. And that means working in a way which is much more reminiscent of, working through a traditional skills pathway in a subject or domain area. So that's what we're concerned with at the moment. And if we want to relate it back to other kinds of frameworks, the cake model of the SDGs, I always feel is the best representation of the SDGs, where you've got the biosphere sitting with society, economy layering on top, but that thing pinning through the middle, SDG 17, is partnership for the goals. And that's been termed as the goal without which all other goals fail. So this is business critical, and this is business critical for us, for the planet. It's also business critical for businesses. And I think that message that we're coming out with is starting to be heard more, starting to land better, but that kind of pushing, advocating, showcasing, but also practically speaking, recognizing those skills, linking them to frameworks, making sure that we can advance them. That's a challenge that I think we all share. This is our touchstone diagram. So if it wasn't clear enough before, I'm hoping this has got that kind of immediate recognizability, I guess, that idea that our business, like our lunch, used to be straightforward. You used to be able to have your lunch and think, I'm just putting this bread together with some filling. And now, of course, it becomes a lot more complex as you become more and more aware of where those ingredients are coming from, or what the impact of what's been happening has had upon the wider industry, or on wider society and on the planet. So this idea of kind of nested ecosystems, interdependent frameworks, is the new business context. And that is a skilled thing to manage. I'm going to just spin you through a little bit. The last one of these that we did, we had a rich conversation about what's stopping us working this way, because I think it's all very well for us to plead for it or do copious LinkedIn posts saying we must. We have to sit in the problem. We have to recognize that there are barriers to this, and sometimes those barriers are hard barriers. So incentives, for example, which means usually commercial and corporate structures, you are legally obliged to work in a competitive way. And that sits somewhere between the incentives locked into business and governance and regulation. It might be illegal for you to collaborate in some domains because it's anti-competitive, because it's anti-consumer. So we can't underestimate the kind of, the barriers to this. It's not all to do with goodwill and appetite and skill. It's also to do with the way that we structure our efforts. So this list of 10 incentives, convention, imagination, it's difficult to work outside existing paradigms, and it's really difficult to encourage other people to do it with us. So we have to be able to come to people with ideas. We have to be able to then work with people on those ideas. That's a tricky task in its own right. We also like to control things. It's a pretty innate thing to be able to say, I can task and complete. That's a really nice thing to be able to do. I can execute this. I know when it's finished. Often in these ways of working, we have to sit with uncertainty more and more. The fact is that this uncertainty is going to come and bite you in the longer term because we're working in these complex and unpredictable situations. That's a little bit more of a, I guess, something which is being revealed bit by bit and which people are more aware of. The emotional side of it is also not to be underestimated. This is in the first session that we did. We talked a lot about being open, what it feels like to be open, what it feels like as a person and an individual. And I think this is something really not to be underestimated, that people feel vulnerable because you have to put your reputation at stake, because you have to put your, there are things in play, and where people have things in play, they feel vulnerable. That anxiety is not to be underestimated as people try to bring in these new practices of working and try and work in new ways. The uncertainty of the new is not something that many people like to embrace. And then, just to talk a bit about even if we got to a commitment, we're still working into that uncertainty. It's slower than we're accustomed to. And it's a really skilled process, and people lack those skills. And that's really what we're working into. So we're offering you the Stacy matrix. Is that mic again coming back in, dropped out? And just to see the most complicated diagram that I've put on so far. But that will only be on for a second. And really it's talking about, this is a Stacy matrix. And it almost mirrors what the last diagram that I showed you, where you've got kind of certainty on the horizontal axis. So do you know what you're doing? Do you have full agreement on what you're doing? And that bottom left-hand quadrant, you can just do it. You do it. It's straightforward. You have your lunch. There is no more implications. But what we're working into increasingly is lack of certainty and lack of agreement. So we're right out in the complex. for most of the things that we're engaging with. I think I don't want to talk about the chaotic zone. There's a lot of work on this out there, and there's people who are much, much better than me at talking about it. The thing that I really want to pinpoint in here is that when you're working into complexity, you need trial and error, you need dialogue and debate. You're innovating just in its very nature because the old ways aren't working. And you have to work with emergent practices. In order to do that, you need to learn, you need new skills, you need to change. So the importance of know-how in this, and this is where I'm just starting to bring it back to us for the last 5 minutes. So we launched Firsthand, which is an idea that we can find that know-how. That know-how doesn't really exist. It doesn't exist in the institutions. It doesn't exist in the universities and colleges that we rely on for know-how. But where it does exist is on the ground. And we went underground initially to start our program. So this is a diagram of the Thames Tunnel, a huge piece of infrastructure transformation that happened in the 1820s. And it's referred to, hugely with Brunel, father and son, working on it using biophilic design. It's a technical innovation, genius, entrepreneurial project. And when it's talked about, it's always talked about in terms of technical innovation. What it actually was a really interesting, complex social and relationship management project where new instruments of finance, new legislation was brought through, new ways of bringing in community and bringing in workers. And none of those stories are told as a piece of change. It was as complex as a United Nations project, but what we talk about always is biophilic design. So I think we have to change the way that we think about this and where we get that knowledge from and how we carry that knowledge forward. And we saw lots of that. I was in Orkney the week before last. We're working with Community Energy Scotland, and we're looking at their communities of practice and their ideas of social technology, about how all of that innovation and change, what they call the shiny show on Orkney, that all of that innovation and change is carried forward off the back of communities of practice and hugely skilled interactions between the different stakeholders in the system. So that skilled practice is 20 years in the making there, if not more, since the first community development trusts bought their own wind turbines. So there's really, really a lot to learn. We just don't take it into the textbooks very often. It's learned on the fly and on the job. And that's why we're going out in person to those places. And I'm just going to finish up for the last couple of minutes to talk about what we are doing in this program. I've left it to the last minute, obviously, but our 2025 program, we are going out to these places which are making change in order to draw out that know-how and that knowledge, and to help these different stakeholders who are interested in that knowledge. And that's not just industry, that's local government, that's community groups who are often innovating outside of that kind of commercial context. It's education institutions who are interested in what that progress looks like on the ground. And we've been convening these groups in tours and in field trips with a view to bringing that knowledge out. So that learning platform which can share insights and intelligence, a community of practice which can start to look at how that ties into frameworks and how you can bring that back into CPD programs, L&D programs, really, really concrete, actionable moves forward. And that feeds back in again, because we can bring that back out to the learning events, which might be tours or field trips, real world learning opportunities. We're running a program this year. Our 2025 program runs in London, the Midlands and Orkney, which is the most exciting thing. We're going to be in Orkney in September, with an idea that in the longer term, we can equip different organizations, different places up and down the country to run their own programs in this way. So we have a lot of experience of open source programs in the past. We think we can bring this to bear on this type of peer learning and communities of practice and place-based exchange. This is what it looks like on the ground, people gathering in breweries and in warehouses. That's some vocational learners from Kingsway College. There's local government that you can see on screen. There's institutional and sector partners, all of them interested in how you start to accelerate this knowledge exchange, and not just in an inspirational, that's interesting way, but in a very, very hard, practical, linking it back into frameworks, making it actionable at scale. This is our program for this year. I'm going to just click out for the last minute to our website, because you can see, I don't need to tell you everything about that myself. I can just leave you with that link, I hope. Firsthand.tours events. We're looking at small projects this spring. We start tomorrow with the Fixing Factory in Camden, and what we're calling a vision of the future made real on a high street in Camden right now. And I think it's very easy to see that as a tiny project, which is a standalone prototype. Actually, the people involved in that, the Restart Project, Possible, RAP, etc., they're looking at large-scale systemic change. They are doing all the work under the bonnet to look at how small projects like this start to seed ideas, start to test ideas of a future that it's not just about encouraging this future, it's about an inevitable future at this point, at a point where waste and repair start to be treated in different ways in society. So each of these small projects, the Felix project have been a supporter of the project since the get-go, opening up their kitchens and opening up their industrial waste, food waste depots. They are a large-scale industrial food redistribution charity who are working in really novel and interesting ways. We're going to the neighbourhood food model in Walworth, who are taking systemic practices to community initiatives in a way which is so refined and so sophisticated, and really sharing what they're learning with lots of other local models along the way. And then in the autumn time, we're looking at scale. I mean, the Midlands is scale at a point where we thought we might be overwhelmed by it, but there's really, really lots of things to learn from things like the Clean Air Act in 1956. What happened then that we can think about now in terms of net zero? And then in the autumn time, we're going to New Covent Garden Food Market, which is really working at scale. It's a local ecosystem in itself, as well as being a key part of the London food ecosystem. Working also with Mission Kitchen, with an incubator on site. We're going to an energy recovery facility and the Tideway. And then Orkney is our kind of jewel in the crown, where we're working with the Science Festival up there to bring a skills wrapper to their ideas of change on Orkney and really share things which have been going on up there. And then it looks like we are working with the Fab Lab in Barcelona to look at food innovation in Barcelona later in the year. And I think I can stop talking there. Is there any burning question?